why are these series so long? I've got some fantasy standalone recommendations for you coming now. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to recommend to you 5 fantasy standalones for those of you who are a bit series fatigued, those of you who are a bit done with the 14-book series, the 10-book series, whatever it is. Here are 5 fantasy standalones I think you'll enjoy and I think are a little bit underrated. So jumping in with book 1, this is Seasons of Albedon by Christopher Warman and Alain Marché. I've talked about this recently on my most recent My Week in Books episode and I absolutely loved this. I read this week and it is a wonderful, wonderful fantasy standalone. It has a very interesting format where we are following 4 different characters but their stories are not interlinked. We are told them as 4 individual short stories, one after the other, and this is very much a character study of these people in this fantasy world setting. This is set in a forest, the forest of Albedon, and this is very much a rural setting what we are following, with folks who are very in tune with nature, in touch with nature and with the seasons. Those 4 characters we are following, one is the apprentice to the local enchantress, another we are following a father who is struggling with alcoholism and how to best help and support his family. We follow a man who is a foreman of a project in the woods trying to bring some new innovation and technology to his culture. And then we are following a young mother who's lost her voice and is fighting for the life of her young baby. For a book that is only 200 pages long, this packed a massive punch. Each of these stories was insightful and interesting and had an emotional beat to them. As well as that, a couple of them really hit me hard in the gut. I can't actually remember the last time I responded so emotionally to a set of stories, particularly not a novel that has so few words in it. It is only 200 pages long and yet it packed a real emotional punch. And it was very impactful for me and I will be recommending this for a long time to come. If you need a short fantasy standalone that dives deep into character work and character study, this is definitely a book for you. And criminally, it has less than 50 ratings on Goodreads. What is that about? Less than 50 ratings. Seriously, you guys should go and pick this up and give it a read. It is the most underrated fantasy standalone I have read probably ever. So guys, I recommend it super highly for you. So from there we are moving into more well-known authors, probably books that people have heard of, although maybe haven't read, or if they have read, seem to be rated much lower than I feel like they probably should be. So in at number 2 is Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. You guys might be thinking, this isn't underrated. Yeah, how many people do you know that have actually read this? I don't think it's widely read in Booktube circles, and it is a wonderful, wonderful fantasy standalone. So this is definitely a chunkier book than the previous one, but it is a book that I absolutely adore. It is possibly my favourite fantasy standalone of all time. It is fighting up there with another Guy Gavriel Kay book, and Guy Gavriel Kay is the master of fantasy standalones. He does such a wonderful job in a short space of time in one book, introducing us to a world, introducing us to a setting and characters that we just absolutely love, and you want to know more, that you are rooting for them and you want them to do well and to achieve their goals. Tigana is really well done thematically as well. It's dealing with themes of identity and memory and nationalism, what it is to belong in a culture or a society. It is just done so incredibly well. And if you have never read any Guy Gavriel Kay, I think this is a really good place to jump in to see some of his wonderful work in fantasy standalones. Before we jump into the next book, if you're enjoying this video, if you are really appreciating seeing some standalone fantasy books to read, do click that like button so more people can see what books they can break up these massive fantasy series with. Up next, I want to recommend to you Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Susanna Clarke is well known for having written Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I didn't really get on with that. What I did get on with is Piranesi, which she released much more recently. Piranesi is again a short standalone. It's only a few hundred pages and it is very much a mystery. I don't want to tell you too much about it, but we are following a character known as Piranesi who lives in a house that is full of water and tides that flood occasionally. It's a very classical, almost labyrinth type setting with huge statues, very classical architecture. And we are following Piranesi by reading his journal entries. I absolutely love the way Susanna Clarke does this. It might be a little bit slow for some people, but I do think it's very interesting in its world building and its mystery. And it's something that I highly recommend going into relatively blind. So if you've not heard too much about it and if you haven't read it yet, highly recommend Piranesi for you. Next up is a recommendation for an author that I have read a lot of recently, and this is Adrian Tchaikovsky, particularly Guns of the Dawn. Guns of the Dawn is a flintlock fantasy sort of crossed with a Jane Austen novel. We are following Emily Marshwick, who is a wonderful, wonderful character, and in the prologue we see her walking through a swamp, being a soldier, part of a war effort. And from there we have a flashback to see what's happened long before this, and we get a very Jane Austen Pride and Prejudice flintlock fantasy combination. It's very interesting, it's extremely well written, the characters are likeable and lovable and just done very well. And again, as you'll see with a lot of my fantasy standalones I love, it has very good theming. It deals very well with the themes of propaganda, what is right and wrong in war, what is the difference between you and your enemy. It's just done very well, explore these themes well. It's never heavy-handed, it's very subtle, and I just love the way it's done, and I particularly love Tchaikovsky's character work. If you really want a good character study or you want flintlock fantasy, this is definitely the book for you. And my last book recommendation for you is going to make you laugh if you've been on Booktube a long time. This is a book that I do think is underrated, and it is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. Now you might say, it's Brandon Sanderson, he's the biggest name in fantasy right now, which is probably true. However, I think that Elantris is slept on massively by the community. Elantris is the first novel by Brandon Sanderson, it was his debut, and in lots of ways it is clearly not quite as good as his latest stuff. You can see very clearly how Brandon has developed as a writer, how he writes in a smoother, much better prose style. I think his plotting is tighter and better now than it was when he wrote Elantris. However, the concept of Elantris is wonderful. This idea of a magic where people sometimes wake up and they've been transformed into this almost angelic being that has access to the magic of the land, where they become wonderful specimens of people who can do the magic and how they want to help the nations around them, is really an interesting concept, especially with the twist Brandon puts on it. At the start of this book, it has been corrupted. And instead of being transformed into these humans who have the ability to engage with the magic, these people instead have a curse put on them and they are turned into basically living dead. This is a zombie apocalypse in a fantasy novel, and it's done very well. There are three protagonists we follow mainly, but I would claim Raiden is probably the main character, and he is just such a relentlessly optimistic man. He is so sometimes painfully optimistic, but he is always looking to do what he can, do the best he can, be the best he can be, and try and work for the best of the people around him. And there is something so engaging and uplifting about following this character through his journey, and I just absolutely adore it. And now, as I said, not the best Brandon Sanderson book, but I do think it might be the most underrated. I hope that list has been useful for you, and I will hopefully see you guys again soon.